Hello, beautiful people. Welcome. Welcome, 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 welcome. My name is Oyemi Kalimaat, and I am zooming in from Monacan land, which is colonially known as Buckingham, Virginia, which is located on the east coast of the United States. And I'll be your host for today's session. And this is the Embodied Lab One-Day Summit on Embodied Trauma Release. And our first session will be with Enkam Endefo and Dr. Scott Lyon, titled Transforming the Stress Paradigm. And in a second, I will introduce you to the both of them. No, they do not need any introduction. If you're part of the Embody Lab, you know these two individuals very, very well. We'll start with Enkam. Enkam brings an abundance of experience as a clinician, educator, consultant, and community strategist to innovative programs that address stress and trauma and build resilience for individuals, organizations, and communities across sectors throughout the US and internationally. She is particularly interested in working alongside people most impacted by violence and marginalization. And then moving on to Scott, Dr. Scott Lyon is the founder of the Embody Lab, a hub for embodied education, self-discovery, and healing, and developer of somatic stress release, a process of restoring our biological adaptation system. Scott is also the founder of Omala, a wellness brand dedicated to creating sustainably sourced tools for transformation. Scott is a licensed clinical psychologist, a doctor of osteopath, and a mind-body medicine practitioner who specializes in therapies for infants, youth, and adults. Scott is also the author of the book, Addicted to Drama, Healing Dependency on Crisis and Chaos in Yourself and Others. So with that being said, welcome Endefo and welcome Dr. Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oyemi.
Yeah. Yeah, so wonderful to be with you all and with you, Inkem, as always.
Oh. So shall we dive in?
We'll start with a just a arrival practice, a short connecting practice to our bodies, to where we are in this moment, and then we're gonna dive into some really juicy material. So I'm gonna invite you all to take some moments just to find your comfort. Meaning, set yourself up for optimal connection to your body, connection to the environment, connection to this session. Yeah. Taking a moment, maybe resting a hand on your body just to feel the temperature of yourself. Of course, you can do that from touching yourself, or you could do it from feeling from the inside. And then perhaps adding to your awareness of breath, movement of your breath. And then adding in perhaps any other sensation or feeling, maybe even imagery that's present here in your body, this moment. And I'm going to invite you to slowly open your eyes if they weren't already. I'm going to invite you, if it's possible, to raise your shoulders up, creating a little bit of activity in your muscles, and then a little slow release. One more time, maybe in your legs, your arms, or somewhere else, adding a little bit of muscular activity. Maybe a stretching and then a release. And then finally, I'm going to invite you to peer out or view out, if that's possible, into your environment. And if visual is not possible, then into something that has sound. So I'd like you to rest your eyes on some color and object, maybe one that is familiar. And as you do that, shifting your awareness from that object or color for a moment and just noticing how your body responds, how your breath responds, how your sense of gravity or weight responds, how the temperature or the sensation in your body responds. Essentially, we're just starting to notice response. And then one last time, shifting your gaze to one other object. It could be a pet, it could be a plant, it could be a person on Zoom, it could be Inken. And then once again, kind of notice, oh, happens here in me, in my sensation, in my breath. In the weight of my body, and that sense of my musculature. Yeah. We're not necessarily doing anything more than just noticing right now that exchange from interaction. Simple interaction. Good. And then let your awareness rest from the thing you've been observing. You can move a little bit just to release that sort of strong attention. Shifting your weight, maybe looking around or letting your awareness expand to your other senses. It's important to kind of jiggle off our more acute attention after a practice too. Good. Now we get to come into the subject material around stress. And even when I say that word, you might even notice you have a response already. Yeah. The word itself can be evocative for many of us. And that's something to already notice because right now we're just using the word stress. Yeah. And if we think back to that practice where I invited you to look at something and just notice your response, this may seem quite simplistic and strange, but right there is embedded in that practice is our definition of stress. And for many of us, we might go, whoa, 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 that's not stress. Stress is my mother-in-law. Stress is my job. Stress is those things that make me go, ah, yeah. And so what we're already beginning with is the question of what is stress? And so many of us might even think it's that big bad boogie monster that exists in the world to cause me distress, frustration, overwhelm. Anyone kind of feel familiar with that? Like stress is that thing over there that does this thing over here to me. Yeah. Kind of feels familiar. Or it's that thing that causes me to either have to fight or flight. Does that kind of feel familiar? Again, it's that thing over there that does this thing over here. And usually it's one of these things, like I have to fight or I have to flee. And there's a reason why that definition kind of got generated that way in that kind of simplistic form. And the reality is stress is so much more. Not so much more of like doom, but so much more actually about our functionality as humans, our functionality as mammals, as beings. And so when we talk about like what is stress, we have to first kind of confront the familiar definitions of it, which is the familiar definition is it's that thing somewhere out there, it's kind of amorphous, that affects me, that causes me harm, that makes me sick, that gets me into fights with my friends or partners or whatever. It's that thing. And what stress really is, dun dun dun, is it's our process, it's our biological process of adapting. That's it. That's what it, even the founders of stress, so to speak, originally intended in their research and understanding, is it's really about how are we in interaction and adapting to the circumstances within ourselves and within life. And how are we at it? How are we at this process of adaptation? So when we think of stress, it's actually divided into two categories. So we have one over here called stressor, which is a stimulus. And over here is a stress response, which is how we are actually preparing and actualizing our process of adapting. Yeah. And a stimulus is just a stimulus. Some stimulus are more intense than others, granted. A big rainstorm might be a bit more stimulus than a sprinkle of water. But our response to that, even between us, like Inkem's response to a rainstorm might be like she gets in a bathing suit and she goes outside and has a puddle fiesta. Yeah. Where I might go, oh gosh, I don't like getting wet. And that seems really overwhelming. It's the same stimulus, but what's different is the stress response. And so often we blame the stimulus, but really it's about us starting to become familiar and in relationship and embodying our internal interaction with it. Does that make sense so far? It's kind of a radical shift, to be honest, from like a lot of the textbook things of like stress is a thing that mostly causes disease, health issues, and we want to get rid of it. And what's interesting, anyone here ever want to just get rid of their stress? Yeah. And what's interesting is in the research and the science of it, when we've gotten in, sorry for saying, I'm going to talk about animal testing. So just trigger warning. I'm not going to go into too much detail. But in the research where they have taken out the mechanisms of dealing with stress, those animals failed to thrive. They no longer were able to exist, not because they didn't have those mechanisms or those parts of them left, because they couldn't adapt. They couldn't be in the dance of life. And that's why it's so imperative that we actually start to like recalibrate our understanding of what is stress. So stress is our process, it's our biological process of adaptation. Yeah. And a lot of us, you know how you can have an emotion like I'm sad or I'm angry. And then we have what's called like a secondary emotion or an opinion of that emotion. Like and then we have this emotion on top of the emotion. Yeah. Like I'm angry, I'm sad. Yeah. Or I shouldn't be sad and therefore I'm dot dot dot. Anyone ever had that experience? We have this easygoing primary emotion and we layer some shit on top. Yeah. Yeah. Welcome to being human. Yeah. Now, we often do that with stress. We start to have some sensation about so the sensation, we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. That sensation that's preparing us to adapt. And then we often interpret it and go, uh-oh, that's the sensation. That means that something bad is happening, or I'm going to get disease, or something like that. Yeah. So I'm going to show a quick slide of what is happening when we're talking about those sensations, which are all the sensations that are just informing us, letting us know that our beings, our bodies are in that process of adaptation. If we allow it to happen. Yeah. Okay, so here's a little slide. So, activation. Anyone in here ever feel like, ooh, my temperature is getting a little hotter. I feel like I'm getting a little tenser. My muscles feel a little like, yeah, my jaw feels a little tight when they are responding to a stimulus. Kind of raise of hands. Anyone ever have a human response? Yeah. So, what that is your body's preparation or release of energy. Yeah. It's going, we got to get energy. We got to put fuel in the car. So my muscles are going to be more engaged. Yeah. Um, I might have more sensation in my chest or my abdomen. I might feel more heat. I might feel that buzziness. Anyone ever feel that kind of buzziness when they're having a stress response? Yeah. Welcome to the world of energy. That's it. Now, so many of us might have interpreted that as uh-oh sensation, but it's actually, yay, my body is actually functionally preparing for me to respond. That's it. Interpretation goes a long way. Yeah. Like I was driving the other day and someone honked at me behind me and I could interpret them as like, that's a really rude person. But I decided to have a playful moment. I was like, oh, they're inviting people into their symphony of experience with sound. And I was like, how fun. How fun is that? It's the same stimulus. I chose how I want to interact with the response. Yeah. So we have activation as one of our first stages of a stress response. That energy goes into mobilization. This might be where we talk about fighting or flighting, but those are just two very simple ideas of action. Mobilizing. I might curl into a ball. I might speak. I might express. I might go for a run. How does that energy want to be moved in order to adapt? A baseball's coming at me. Do I duck? Do I catch? Do I shout at it? Like, do I? We have a lot of options. Yeah. So when they say fight or flight, what they're referring to is the options of mobilization. The options that I hopefully have, but some of us are limited in them based on our experience or cultural or what was modeled or what was deemed appropriate or safe, of how we can move that energy to adapt. Yeah. Then we have deactivation, which is the release of what was needed in order to release energy, in order to move. It's also, this is the stage where we get to go from more of a engaging place to more of an internal reflecting place. Our blood flow goes back into our organs. We become more attuned with our emotions. Yeah. We're releasing a lot of hopefully, if we've mobilized that energy, then we're beginning to release the musculature, and the muscular preparation of response because we've actually responded. Yeah. Oftentimes when we feel that tension just kind of still in our jaw or shoulder, it means we haven't properly mobilized that energy often. Yeah. From deactivation, we often think that deactivation is where we just rest. It's not. Yeah, this was often called rest and digest, but there's actually a lot of activity happening, including the processing of the experience. Once we have allowed ourselves or been given support to process that, we go into restoration, which is the restoring of the energy that's needed to go into this activation. Yeah. So we have energy, we have the movement of that energy or the actualization of it in order to adapt. I catch the ball. I'm releasing all the extra musculature, all the extra hormones, all the extra neurological processes that were needed in order to do these first two stages, which allows me to start to restore even on a cellular level, restore the energy, build the energy that's needed to do this cycle to be able to adapt. So that the next time a baseball comes at me, I can catch it again, or I can duck, or I can run into it if I want. It's my choice. Yeah. And that's the cycle of stress. So it's a lot more than just fight or flight. It's actually this whole cycle that is so needed in order to be in the dance of life, to keep adapting, to keep having agency and choice and empowerment, to be in the interaction and the processing of it. So that is a quick but important process of stress. And we already kind of did a basic practice of that. So I'm not going to do too much more right now. We might come back to another practice, but just the basic practice of I observed a stimulus, I noticed my response. The next stages of that process that we might do later and we might not is, what does that energy want to do next? That's it. Yeah, it doesn't have to be some like, oh my gosh, I'm in a stress experience. We kind of add that layer onto it. And sometimes it's really appropriate because it's too much too soon, or we don't have enough resources to bring us from that activation into actualizing that energy. Yeah.
Thank you for the segue. You just landed that right on my lap. Um, I think it's so important when we talk about anything is that we define terms. And so Scott's given us a really nice grounding definition here. And it's also equally important that we talk about what the thing is not. So we've talked about some of what stress is, and we also want to talk about what stress is not. And I think as people are becoming more and more comfortable talking about trauma, there is a conflation of trauma and stress. In fact, people say, oh, that's traumatizing. Oof, this is traumatizing. And if everything is trauma, nothing is trauma. So I think we need to do just a little pulling apart, right? What is stress and what is trauma? And so, the short definition that Scott already intimated here, which I love, it's short and punchy, of trauma being too much too fast. Sometimes also too little for too long. Right? I'd like to offer a longer definition that expands it a little bit, and then talk a little bit about where is that line between stress and trauma. And so I love, this is a particular definition of trauma that I live in Tovangar, colonially known as Los Angeles, California, and it's a very large metropolitan area, 10 to 11 million people. And a group of us got together to, how are we going to approach trauma in our region? And we said, first, we have to define trauma. So I love this definition. It's a product of a lot of people and a lot of work. Is what we say is trauma references, it could be a single event, a series of events, or ongoing circumstances that is experienced or perceived. And I think perceived is important. It's not just what you experience, it's your perception. And here it is, physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening. And the effects are profound. I'm going to say that. The effects are profound and long-lasting, resulting in diminished functioning in every domain: physical, mental, emotional, social, spiritual. All this sense of well-being is affected, right? So profound, long-lasting effects. What's important there, again, to highlight is perception. We really can't. I know if somebody does say, I said it earlier, people are saying, that's traumatic, that's traumatic. I do think the word can be overused. However, we cannot impose our beliefs on someone else. If someone else says that something was traumatic for them, We don't know their life story. We don't know their resources. We have to accept people at their word. It's the same thing with stress. Stress is about perception, which is a lot of what Scott was saying. It's our, right? We have a new, the stimulus is the stimulus. Our perception will influence what our response is. And what's important with both stress and trauma, where they are similar, is that the impact can vary depending on resources, right? Internal resources and external resources. So one of the examples I love to do is if we think about the early COVID pandemic, and we will hear people say everybody was in the same boat. It expected everybody worldwide. People could say but why might it be a stressor and not a trauma for one person, right? Or why might it be a trauma for another person and not a stressor? Let's look at resources, right? So what would happen when the pandemic hit? Let's say you lived in a big house. So if somebody got sick, they could isolate. If you had, you could work from home. You did not have to go into a workplace. You did not have to use public transport. You had private transport, so you were not as exposed as much. Your workplace, if you got sick, would pay you to stay home. You had plenty of economic financial reserves in the bank. So when the pandemic hit, if you had that level of resources, external resources, it might have been just a stressor. And you had a stress response. But if you didn't have those resources, you could see how it would cross the line to become a trauma. And so this gets us into that continuum about when does stress become trauma? The absence of resources or the ability to receive resources to weather stress is what pushes it into trauma. Because sometimes the resources aren't there, but sometimes they are there and we reject them. Right? So that's what the line is. It's a bit arbitrary, right? That we're not talking about, we're not doing math formulas here. And I really cannot stress enough that we need to trust people in their perceptions. As people become, I think, less activated, stress activated, our perceptions tend to clarify and we're better able to distinguish, oh, that really wasn't that bad, or oh, really, that was that bad. I was minimizing it. Right? So what I'd love to turn to now is just a little bit about this idea that all stress is bad, that Scott touched on. All stress is bad. Because in fact, it's not true. I want to separate out, we have three types of stress here. You're going to be like, oh, stress, stress, stress. We talk about it so much, we feel so stressed. There is what we call eustress. It's spelled EU. EU stress. Eustress. And EU as a prefix means normal, right? So the garden variety, if you're laying down and then you stand up, this is your body has to, as Scott says, adapt. So the way my blood flows, I now have to get blood from when I was laying flat, it's just a nice even flow. When I stand up, that blood has to go from my feet all the way up to my head, to the top floor. That's an adaptation for my body. That's a stress. And for most of us, eustress, it's a eustress to stand from here, from here to here. But if you're very weak, if you're sick, if you have a disability, right, of some kind, you do that, that may be much more than just a eustress, right? That's when it might be what the second type of stress, we say it's tolerable. Like I can tolerate it. I have to adapt, but it's within my bandwidth to adapt. It's tolerable. Right? The third would be distress. Now we're starting to stretch into this is really pulling me beyond, right? It's starting to tax me at the limits of my resources. And remember, I said the line that would push us up into trauma, right? It is beyond, right, where we have resources and has a profound and long-lasting impact, right? Because I can just be pushed up slightly, right, into distress because I'm beyond my resources. But when I come out of it, there's no profound and long-lasting impact. It's not a trauma, that's distress. Okay, so eustress, good, you know, because it's actually good for us to move our blood around in that example, right? Tolerable within my bounds, and distress, you've now stretched me beyond, but I'm not in the land of trauma where I'm having profound and long-lasting impact. The things to think about here are intensity. How intense is something, right? And then the other thing to think about is what we call valence. Valence is which direction does it go? Is it in a positive direction? Is it in a negative direction? So valence and, valence and intensity combine. So I could have something that is high intensity and in the positive direction. So let's say, for example, an example I like to use is getting married. I'm excited to get married. This is the love of my life. We're getting married. And so it's a positive valence, but the intensity, woof, I have to say, secret guilty pleasure, reading Reddit subreddits about wedding disasters. Boy, weddings bring out the worst in people, let me tell you. Right? So apparently it's distressing for a lot of people, right? But ostensibly, this is something that's positive, but the intensity is high. And there are situations where we see people have a hard time with intensity, period, right? They have a hard time with intensity, period, even good intensity. You often see this in transgenerational trauma, right? It's actually one of the hallmarks of transgenerational trauma is this, you'll see almost like a guilting, like others have suffered in our, in our lineage. How dare you have joy, right? How dare you enjoy? You'll see this, right? So I referenced the work of Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, an indigenous on Turtle Island, known as North America, who writes beautifully about historical trauma and this around the sort of this upper limits problem in terms of intensity, even on the side of goodness. It makes sense to think of high intensity on a negative valence. Of course, you think, okay, this is going to be distressing. But we don't often think about sometimes people have trouble with just intensity, not necessarily just with the valence. Is it positive or is it negative? And so, and this is something, I think is worthy of reflection, is how well do we tolerate, right? What is our tolerance, our capacity for accepting goodness? This will often, be it's worthy of some self-reflection, right? Because it can touch into worthiness, right? So if we have traumas, now I'm saying traumas around worthiness, when you're often can also see some problems at that upper limit intensity of goodness. And then this idea of rejecting, right? Of rejecting resources. So what I would like to just ask for just a little bit of quiet reflection, just some quiet reflection, this is just for you right now, is this question of how to know when you are nearing the limits of your distress tolerance, right? How do you know when it's going from tolerable stress, right, to, okay, now I've stretched and now I'm in distress? What are the signs that you notice in your body that tell you I'm at my limit? What are the signs that happen for you emotionally? Maybe there's mental effects that you're noticing, signs. And even you might notice how you are with other people socially. So let's just think, just kind of some feel into that, reflect on that. Maybe you just take like a minute here just to touch into that gently. And then I'll have some little ideas to expound on that. So maybe that just gives you just a little bit of a hint, right? Just a little bit of a hint of what those signs might be. Scott and I had a conversation about this, and what we really came to is that the global hallmark of the sign that you're nearing that or passing that threshold is that there's usually a desire for or actual disconnection of some kind. So I'm going to say it's either a desire for or actual disconnection of some kind. And so thinking about socially, what that might be is I'm at my limits, I'm retreating, or I want to run. So whether you actually are able to run or not, there's a sense of retreating. There is, when you're at your limit, the body starts to pull in and recoil, right? We tend to disconnect from the present moment, right? Either we're projecting into the future or we're stuck in the past. We are at our limit. When we say it, I've had enough. What do we say? I've had enough. I mean, I think colloquially, sometimes, we can go into all the research and y'all, I'm going to do some in a minute. But sometimes I think just a gestalt understanding of it is really useful. There are many ways to know things. Research isn't the only thing. I'm actually going to take a couple of these questions just right now in flow. And then I know we're going to do some at the end, but I do just think I have a second and I'm just going to do this. Here, inner resources. Charlotte asks about defining inner resources to respond to stress. I gave that example of all kinds of outer resources. So inner resources have to do with some qualities of resilience, for example. One of the things, an inner resource is the capacity for what's known as meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is the ability to observe ourselves without getting caught up in what we're observing. And that's a quality that can be developed through mindfulness practices, for example. So that would be one inner resource. Another inner resource, faith. People who have some kind of spiritual faith. Research is actually quite clear that this is an inner resource. Let me see what other kind of examples. A connection to something larger than yourself, which may or may not be spiritual in nature. So a connection to a cause. Uh, Altruism also is an inner resource we find that builds resilience. Um, there are uh, both genetic and epigenetic effects that build resilience. Transgenerational trauma impacts the way our stress system functions that can make us more reactive, which would influence how we respond to stress. So I hope that was helpful, Charlotte, in answering some of there's many, but just to give some examples of what could be an inner resource that helps us to respond to stress. Our life experience, right? I would also say would be very, very useful. Lilac asks, wouldn't repeating distress in our formative years necessarily end up being trauma, complex trauma? Not necessarily. Really, not necessarily. It again has to do with the degree of resources. Some children are more, okay, some children are more inner resourced. If there's a lot of transgenerational trauma, you can be epigenetically vulnerable to having more trauma. And that the research is very clear about that. But let's say there was not a lot of that. There might be resources external to the family or the caregiving wherever the child is. It depends at what age these happen. Some ages are more epigenetically sensitive or more developmentally sensitive. So not necessarily. Again, the line from distress to trauma has to do with the resources to meet the challenge, to meet the adversity. So if there's enough of them, then it's going to outstrip the resources. Then yes, it could be traumatic, but it's not a given. And I have actually seen and worked with people who have experienced things that I would say, that sounds like a trauma. But you know what? They were really well resourced as children and they weathered what I would have said would have been traumatic, and they did not find those issues to be traumatic, nor did they show long-lasting effects. So not a given. Okay, I'm going to hold the rest of the questions until after. One thing we wanted when we said, this whole session is about this, how are we looking at the stress paradigm? How are we transforming the stress paradigm? We've talked about it's not just fight flight, it's a cycle. We've talked about stress is not trauma, right? The myth busting, right? All stress is bad. We just talked about good stress, right? It's really more the tolerance levels for intensity. What I now wanted to spend a little bit on is the idea of stress and homeostasis. That's a little pet peeve of mine. People often talk about stress in terms of homeostasis. And let me just say really clearly, this is not appropriate. I'm known to say the spicy things. Homeostasis is a body process that is reserved for simple processes that they're very simple and are more related to set points. Okay. So let me give an example. It's like, when you say, typically people say something's out of whack, you need homeostasis to bring it into balance, right? And that's true for simple processes in the body, like body temperature. Okay. So humans, our body temperature is controlled in a super narrow range. If you go too cold, you're hypothermic, your organs shut down. You get too hot, you're hyperthermic, your organs shut down. So your body will do all kinds of things to help you stay in this narrow range, right? Your brain tells you you're cold, so you put on clothes. If that's not enough, you start shivering, right? If it's too hot, your brain says, take off the clothes. If that doesn't work, you start sweating, right? All to keep you within this narrow range. It's not a complex thing we're talking about. But homeostasis does not, it's very linear. And when we talk about stress, stress is complicated, right? This is just a teeny little, we're just doing a little bit. I teach a course, a certification program where we spend weeks talking about all of the different types of this from different angles. And so stress involves not just our autonomic nervous system. There's a lot of autonomic nervous system determinism that I'm seeing around in the somatic field, where everyone's talking about the vagus nerve as if it's the only nerve in your body, right? Our body is a symphony, and in the stress response, y'all, it's not just the fight, flight, and adrenaline, right? It's not the hypothalamic pituitary axis, your adrenal glands are involved, your gut is involved, your immune system is involved, and guess what? Even your bones make a hormone involved in the stress system, the stress response. So it's a whole body response. It is not just simple adjusting the temperature, which is homeostasis, right? We're just adjusting the temperature. What the term that we use that is best to describe for stress is called allostasis, not homeostasis. It's allostasis, A-L-L-O, stasis. And this is the concept that describes all of the body systems that help keep homeostasis in check. Right? All the things the body does to keep those set points, right? Because it's our blood needs to be a certain pH, our body needs to be a certain temperature, our electrolytes need to be at a certain level, or we die. So homeostasis is really, really tight. But our body does all kinds of things, all kinds of adaptive, adaptation, right, to maintain stability. And so really, when we start talking about stress, allostasis is the term that we want. And so if I come to that example again of if you're laying down and you need to stand up, your body does all kinds of adaptations in your heart rate and your blood pressure to make sure that you have enough blood flow to your brain when you stand up that you can think coherently, right? And you don't pass out. Those are allostatic changes. This is why we would use this in terms of stress. And so I love Bruce McEwen is a big researcher in the field of allostasis, and he describes allostasis as whole body adaptation, and he includes behavior too, which I love, not just the physiology, but also behaviorally, that maintains stability through change. Allostasis is the process of maintaining stability through change. Stability is the homeostasis. Okay. And allostatic load is when the stressors, right, outstrip our ability to adapt. And when the stressors outstrip our ability to adapt, right, we already talked about it. In the psychological terms, we say that's trauma. In physiologic terms, we say it's allostatic load. Okay. And so what happens often is the stress systems, when we have too much stress, the too much too fast or too little for too long, the traumas of overwhelm or the traumas of deprivation, right? Too far over, distress that has tipped over, our body systems become dysregulated and dysfunctional, not just the autonomic nervous system, y'all. So when we have, for example, chronic stress, it changes, right, how much cortisol our body puts out. Cortisol it does many things in the body, right? And when we're constantly pumping it out, year after year after year in the high end of tolerable stress into distress, no surprise, we're going to end up with things like osteoporosis because cortisol will pull calcium from your bones. So these things can have long-lasting impacts, right? It's not just short-term, and it still doesn't quite meet the threshold of trauma. So hopefully that's helpful, that we've teased out some of these, how stress is commonly thought of as only fight flight. It's thought of as all bad. It's thought of as you just need homeostasis, right? And you have a little better understanding, right, of the stress response, reaction, what's happening in your body on a somatic level, on a physiological level. I know this is such a short session, and I feel like we've just like done like a millimeter deep and 12 inches wide. I would love if we have a bunch of questions. Scott, do you feel up to taking questions? Okay. So, this is what makes it the most relevant to y'all when we can answer your questions.
Should we take the first question that had
14?
14 upvotes?
Yes, absolutely. Do it.
All right. So Sam asked, Scott just said that we have a choice on how we respond to stress, example, a ball coming towards us. However, doesn't the autonomic nervous system act beyond the will of cognitive process when it comes to survival stresses? Example, I'll leave it there because then they give an example, but what a fun question to nerd out on the nervous system with. All right. So, this is one of the most common misconceptions on the physiology of stress. So we get to recorrect that. So, yes, is the autonomic nervous system involved in the stress response cycle? So, the autonomic nervous system, known for things that are physiological processes beyond our tracking, like the changes of our blood pH or our temperature, things like that, or the release of glucocorticoids or stress hormones. Yeah. Are we tracking that, or am I saying release the stress hormones now? Probably not. And so that's within the autonomic nervous system. Now, when we say the words fight or flight, so often those terms were associated with also the autonomic nervous system. But guess what? They are not. They are part of what's called the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system is what innervates, and it's a conscious part of our nervous system. So if I have my hat here and I throw it up and catch it, that involved lots of things, but including my somatic nervous system to action. So often in the history of stress, the somatic nervous system was left out. The sort of like forefathers of stress were not movers and shakers. So they literally did not explore movement and the physiology of it. And so it kind of just got left out and then perpetuated. So like the terms fight or flight or those action-based mobilizing terms kept being used, but associated with the wrong part of the nervous system. Still are. They still are taught that way. And I'm like, hello, welcome to 2024, where we have updated information, but we're not talking about it so regularly. Fine. But that's where that confusion exists. And why, if we just say that the stress response happens purely in the autonomic nervous system, then we are robbing ourselves of our own agency that we actually do have, which is part of our voluntary nervous system, our somatic nervous system. So essentially, sorry,
There's
go ahead.
so much reductionism that happens. If your Instagram feed looks like mine, it's like, everybody is a nervous system educator. And, there's just a lot more nuance. And most people don't want to read a research paper. Most people don't want to sit through a full physiology course or keep up with the new research as it develops because we are still learning.
Yeah.
that these are systems that sing together. I think the best way to think of this is these are symphonies. Some things are in our control, some things are not in our voluntary control, and there's a lot of crosstalk. There is a lot of crosstalk. And the idea about where we can have self-agency, we want to see the places where we have voluntary control so we can work with our bodies instead of being hijacked by our bodies. And so a lot of the focus is on, we try to focus in, when we work in somatics, is where are our entry points that we can have that voluntary control, and even bringing awareness to involuntary processes is valuable.
Yeah. And even often involuntary processes, we might have been modeled or learned culturally, or even in our own experience, been limited. So a ball's coming at me, and the only familiar pathway or thought I have is I have to catch it. But the moment when you go, I could not catch it and just move to the side, is one of those moments that is so empowering. Does anyone have that experience of the like constantly they're in a fight with their partner, fight, 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 and you could go, oh, or I could just say, I need a pause. What? It's that expansion of the vocabulary of choices that does come as part of the stress response cycle too, and healing.
Thank you for bringing in the cultural aspect, because we do know that there is, bidirectionality between biology and culture. Absolutely. Nothing's in a vacuum, y'all. Thank you, Sam, for your question. Um, how about Jessica? Jessica, you have your hand up? Jessica Vaca?
Yeah, the C is silence. So it's like laughing, baha.
Okay.
So I had two questions, and one of them you flagged to want to answer. It was about us limits and how we use boundaries to connect or to trauma and stress relief, like hitting our limits, being that observer, defining our boundaries, and being able to either release that trauma or stress, or create better tools to maybe even like heighten those limits or boundaries so we're more adaptable next time. That's the first question I had. And then the second one that I'm really interested in what your answer is like how the allostatic load can interact with self-medication and addiction, which would even further amplify health concerns in people.
Okay. So Bruce McEwen actually writes really nicely about behavior. And if you think about allostasis, okay, so allostasis and allostasis is a good thing. Allostatic load is not a good thing. So just remember, because sometimes people will collapse them into one and think all allostasis is bad. No, that's the load. So allostasis is adaptive. So how do we adapt, right, to maintain stability through change? And some people will have maladaptive allostatic behaviors like addiction, right? Like abuse. These types of things are maladaptive allostatic behavior, and usually trying to compensate for something else, trying to cope for something else. And I think we can all understand that, whatever the trauma is that underlies, right, or whatever's happening, the lack of resourcing that underlies that. So the question about how that interacts with, clearly, if you're having a maladaptive behavior, it can then add to allostatic load. So if you're using methamphetamine, it's going to cause brain damage, which is going to, right, further the load and decrease your resilience on the other side. So that's that interplay. And then the other question you asked was about how to increase our threshold for distress. I wasn't quite sure if you could just add a little clarification.
Yeah, so I'm kind of curious how, sorry, I just had a pop up. How boundaries, like how observing these behaviors? Sorry, let me get back to the question. How do recognizing those limits, like when we're like, ooh, too much, I'm going away, how much do those limits connect with boundaries, and how much do implementing boundaries connect with trauma release and stress release?
Boundaries can mean all different kinds of things. I mean, so recognizing your own threshold that I'm coming into distress, recognizing the threshold that I'm coming into towards trauma. Sometimes some recognition, if it's not, so it can help us pivot. Usually awareness brings more choice by and large. Not always, not everyone has choice, depending on their circumstances, their ecology around them. But awareness can open up choice points to mitigate and prevent further stress and possible trauma. I actually don't believe trauma can be released. That's my belief. You can release stress, but you cannot release trauma. Trauma is not a volume. Trauma is a pattern and an experience that needs to be repatterned, not released. When people try to do catharsis, and I'm sure I did something for Embody Lab on this. I don't know, it's probably in the library somewhere. So if you're a member, it's floating around in Embody Lab about the dangers of catharsis. It's a whole nother topic we're not talking about here, but like suffice to find that it's somewhere floating around in Embody Lab. So yes, being aware. I also, sort of the process often happens is, we're hijacked by our stress and we're not aware of it. That's step number one. Number two, as we become aware, oh, whoa, look what's going on, but we don't really feel able to change it. But at least now we have awareness. That's step two, right? Right. And we start to, as we grow the awareness, right, we start to become aware of earlier and earlier signs, not like, okay, now I'm completely past the line. Now I'm aware of early signs. And if you're aware of early signs, right, you're more likely to be able to change and pivot and do something differently, right? There starts to become a gap between I'm aware of what's going on and before I have a response time, which opens up space for even more choicefulness. Right. And then it's practice of doing something differently, either removing myself from the situation, settling disproportionate responses. I developed an entire approach around how to recognize disproportionate responses called the Resilience Toolkit and how to settle the disproportionate responses. That's and that when we do that repeatedly, we get better. It's like a skill, right? And so we get better at it. Our muscles are stronger to do it, and we can do it more reliably, earlier, and mitigate stress for sure. So hopefully that answers, Jessica. Thank you. Do you see when you're going to take, Scott?
Sure. Yeah, there was a request about just repeating the somatic stress cycle, or the stress response cycle, and the very more simplified version is simply activation, the rising of energy, mobilization, the action of adaptation, deactivation is the restoring or the reconnecting to their body, emotions, the physiological process of coming down, basically, and then restoration is the building of energy. And often different folks get stuck in different places in that cycle. They might have like, ooh, I start getting that activation, that sensation, that energy rising. Oh no, it's bad. I got to clamp it down. I got to meditate it away, or whatever, or disconnect from it. Or often we don't have an opportunity to mobilize that energy, of restoring that sense of like, ooh, I just need to feel that push, or I need to feel that like twist in my body where that the sort of completion of what that energy wanted, or I never really come back to myself, or I never give myself the time to restore, and so I end up burned out because I never get to restore the energy needed in the cycle. I just keep going and going and going without replenishing.
Okay, this has 14 votes, and then we'll do Louise, and then I know we gotta. So I'm just gonna answer. Kea asks, could you say more about when one has trauma around self-worth that you experience difficulty with high intensity positive situations? When we have trauma around self-worth, we have parts of ourselves that believe we are unworthy. We believe there's a lot of shame that we are bad, we are whatever, unlovable. And so when somebody, let's say I have a trauma around being unlovable, right? This is and so part of myself believes this, it's a self-worth issue, and someone attempts to love me. It is going to rattle that part of myself that does not believe this and is connected to whatever developmental patterns or cultural patterns, right, that I've experienced that have now embedded into part of me. And it's going to cause a lot of dissonance, a lot of dissonance. So this is why and you'll see it where like a relationship is going really, really well, and someone just blows it up because they can't tolerate the goodness of the love. You see it in workplaces, right? I've done a lot of work with people coming out of prison, for example, they go to job training, and then when they are going into the workforce, and here it is, their dream job, and they just blow it up. I don't deserve this. And so we've actually done training to grow resilience, right? To tolerate the intensity of sensation in job training programs, somatic interventions in job training programs, so that by the time people don't blow it up when the goodness comes. So hopefully that's helpful. All right, one more. Luisa.
I think this question kind of goes to what Scott just said, that often we get equipped, and I think that's also the trend that we see in like all the social media, that the energy is not really able to flow, and we suppress the energy. So there's a lot of activation. So we were saying everything comes from activation, and then we do like breathing techniques where we like downregulate, but the actual energy is suppressed, is still there. So what's the way to choose, and which kind of resources would you use there?
So if I understand the question, it's how do we help mobilize energy towards completion?
Yeah.
Yep. I would say there's a lot of different ways. Sometimes it's moving, sometimes it's not moving, sometimes it's micro movements, sometimes it's idiokinesis or the imagery of movement. And so we have a lot of options. It's not about getting rid of it. That's a misconception. We're not trying to like, here's some energy, like the baseball's coming at me. I never do anything. I have that energy of response. Doesn't mean I have to go outside and go catch a ball. It could mean that I simply find where that energy is and see what type of organically, what movement. It might be a little shaking. It might be me clapping my hand. It might be me dancing. It might be, but I'm not trying to just like dispose of it. I'm trying to see, I'm asking myself the question, how does this energy want to complete itself, move through me, not move out of me necessarily? Yeah. And Kim, did you want to add anything to that? No, we have to land. Beautiful. Thank you all for your beautiful questions. Just in the respect and boundary of time, I know we have to land this session, but you have so many more amazing sessions in this summit coming your way. And we just want to thank you so much for joining us. And Kim, always such a pleasure, my love.
I wish we had much longer, but in respect for everybody, all the presenters coming after us who are going to take you on such a journey. Thank you all. Thank you all for your presence and your attention and your really thoughtful questions.